We have a variety of topics to cover today. We're continuing a series or a mini-series in the discussion of Ukraine, but we're going to mix in some other topics. We're going to talk about abortion. We're going to talk about world wars. We're going to talk about Black Lives Matter, throw some ideas. But I don't want you to be alarmed because today I have passed, as the benevolent dictator of this podcast, the Controversial Podcast Reduction Act, which means that there will be no controversies at all because I've passed this law by unanimous decision. And since I passed this law, you can see what the name is, that it is the the Controversy Reduction Act. So it's actually, we know that it's going to reduce controversy. My name is Andrew Green. This is the Idea Collision, where we throw a bunch of ideas like these together and see what comes out, always with a view towards coming away with something spiritual. As a preacher and a former missionary in Ukraine, this is specifically a topic that's near and dear to me. And I know it sounds like I've picked a lot of controversial topics, but do not be alarmed. There's no controversy. Just trust what it says. It's similar to a few years ago. And I know you look at things and you say, man, prices are higher, but the prices are not higher. You know that. You should know that prices are not higher in the United States because several years ago we had an Inflation Reduction Act. And since we had an act that says that prices would not be inflated, your prices didn't go up. This is all a figment of your imagination. So, you're just obviously imagining things. Well, I've always been a believer in truth in advertising, right? And we don't always have it. Obviously, in the making of our laws, we have a failure in truth in advertising. Things that tend to be, in advertised as one way are really the other, the opposite. We have a group, very popular group, known as Planned Parenthood. Really, what it is Planned Unparenthood. That's really what they're trying to plan. So we just take the opposite a lot of times, and that's actually the reality. You can do it that way you want as we continue here. Now, because of, as we get to Ukraine, a lot of us want justice, and we've covered the idea of justice for Ukraine. And I want to go through a couple of different topics and kind of bring it back around to this. When we talk about what caused World War II, the quick answer would obviously that you have this megalomaniac named Adolf Hitler, and we're not going to suggest that that's not true, and wanted to take over the world and had a couple of, henchmen in various parts of, Europe and Asia that had similar viewpoints. But that's not actually the real answer, because for us to get to that guy, we have to figure what made that guy. How did that guy get to where he was? And that's the real answer, the root cause of World War II. There's actually two of them. I mean, probably more than that, but we can look at a couple of them. So in the late 1800s, what is happening is Russia, even before the Soviet Union, Russia was persecuting Jews, and so they were going all over Europe, and so this was creating problems. Now, a lot of them wanted a homeland. So in 1917, England, who controlled the Middle East at the time, made an agreement as the World War I started heating up. World War I heated up, and it was, we talked about this last time, the Ottoman Empire, which was Turkey and Germany. And so they said, basically, if you'll help support us, I don't know with money or what have you, if you'll help support us, England was the one that primarily made this agreement. I'm sure there were other nations involved, but it was primarily England. We will cut out some land out of Palestine and give it to you as a nation state, as a homeland. This is referred to as the Balfour Agreement. And so they did. They signed on with it, and they won. The Allies, or whatever they were called, won. I think they had a different name, but in World War I. But so Germany and Turkey were defeated, and England reneged. So we had now an issue in Europe. So what happened was, over the next couple of decades, you have all these Jews. They were taking jobs. Well, another thing happened and combined with this event that really made the problem worse. And that was the Treaty of Versailles. The Treaty of Versailles was at the end of World War I. Europe, primarily, was really ticked off at Germany, and they really took all their frustrations out on Germany. And they said, listen, you're going to pay for everything, number one. Number two, you're going to give up land to Europe for doing that. So they did that. And these two problems, and that was justice, because we felt, listen, Germany was a large part of the problem. As we know, Ottoman Empire, we talked about this last time, was declining. And so Germany really took the forefront here. And so we punished them harshly, because that feels like justice. We want justice. You can kind of see a little of where I'm going with where you're hearing a lot of this. Is this aggressor in Europe by the name of Vladimir Putin, and we really want a pound of flesh is what we want. And that's what we did to Germany. So you had two factors. So now we didn't let Jews, which there were millions of in Europe, go to their homeland. And now you have some economic depression. So you have a competition for property. You have a competition for jobs. And who are the people who aren't supposed to be there? Right? It's the Jews. Now, they had been sympathetic to the Jews, but because there's so many of them, and then they reneged, and then there's now added economic stress that in Germany, there's this newfound hatred for them. Right? Adolf Hitler didn't create hatred for the Jews. That was already there. He capitalized on it, in other words. Hitler would have been a failing artist if the Balfour Agreement had been, if that had been honored by the English. Or if we hadn't been so cruel to Germany, they might have had an economy that could have survived and weathered an influx of Jewish people. But both of those things together caused the collapse of Germany. And 20 years later, when the population was coming back, you had a ticked off group of people. So the pound of flesh didn't really work. It felt good, in 1921 and 1917. That felt good, but it didn't end up producing what people wanted. And sometimes we get the opposite. Sometimes there's not truth in advertising. This is what this is going to do. And it actually ends up producing the opposite. Now, we've talked about Europe, but let's go back to Japan. Who caused all the stuff in Japan? There was a guy by the name of Emperor Hirohito. I mean, it's more complex than that, because their generals had a lot of involvement in politics and things like that. But Emperor Hirohito became emperor in, I want to say, 1929. And he is not a nice guy historically. He is the mastermind of what's referred to variously. It's called the Nanjing massacre, or in the anglicized version is the rape of Nanking. It's so horrific in a short period of time. The woman that wrote the book, herself Chinese, and I'm trying to remember her name, and I can't remember it, but she ended up committing suicide because just the material for the book was so awful. She went into a spiral a depressive spiral and ended up taking her own life. So, whatever happened, simultaneous to, I don't know if we learned our lesson from World War I to World War II, but Emperor Hirohito served as emperor for 9 American presidents. 9. And that's after World War II. That's not including before. He died in 1989 under George H.W. Bush, a guy that masterminded the rape in Nanking and Pearl Harbor and all these other things that he was a part of. Japan didn't pay for Pearl Harbor. We never asked a dime for Japan from Pearl Harbor. In fact, we rebuilt Japan, and they are now one of our strongest allies in the world. It is a different approach. I'm going to say this, and a lot of people probably disagree with me, fine, or hate the idea of it, but had Adolf Hitler not killed himself and surrendered, he would have been treated as a diplomat. Likely. Because we did that with, we talked to Joseph Stalin. We called him Uncle Joe, this nice guy who only killed, 20 million people. And Emperor Hirohito. During Black Lives Matter, there was a protest kind of over terminology. And I'm not talking about the All Lives Matter controversy. I'm talking about a different terminology controversy. I don't want to get into that one. But there were people who said, wait a minute, do even all Black lives matter to you? And the reason they asked that is because they broke down and statistically looked at the one thing that was being protested specifically, and it's a thing that's not acceptable, it's not good, but unarmed Black people being killed by white police officers is a problem. That's not good, and that's primarily what they were protesting. Well, but that's a really broad phrase to use for something that statistically actually only happens 3 to 7 times a year. Now, and without even getting into other analysis of situation and events, just taking that as a blanket statement, we're pouring millions and millions of dollars into all these protests for all these things. Just this year, already, so it's the beginning of March. This year, there's been 12 homicides in Milwaukee. 8 of them are blacks, that victims. Most of the perpetrators, just by virtue of the demographics, are black. There's not been a single protest. Right? And so it's like, well, truth in advertising would suggest that, are you interested in other people other than these 3 to 7 people per year? There are lots of innocent black lives that are suffering. Are you interested in them? Forget other races, forget any of that. Let's have some truth in advertising. Someone said, well, wait a minute. If I had a cancer, this was the argument that I heard. If I had a cancer charity, I wouldn't have to say, and it goes towards this one thing, that would be okay, would it? Do I have to support all cancer groups? No. But you should say so. If you have a group, we have the American Cancer Society, or I think that funds, multiple types or what have you. We have a lot of very niche ones. Breast cancer is there's lung cancer. There's all sorts of pancreatic cancer and there's groups that just fund money just for those different, research. But if I said, I'm founding the Cancer Research Group, and I only give I take in these millions and millions of dollars, and I donate it to something that kills like 7 people a year, people would go, was that just a great waste of my money? I mean, I know I feel good for those 7 people if you did something to help them, but, you kind of have a general view of something. Right? We want honesty in what we're advertising. Now, most of the people watching this are religious to some degree or another. So I'm going to kind of start to tie all these ideas together. What does it mean to be pro-life? What comes into your mind when I say pro-life? I'm pro-life, and I am pro-life. What does that mean? Well, as soon as we say that, whether you are or not, you can take someone that's not pro-life, you can take someone that is pro-life, they can identify it in one word. There's one word that is always associated with being pro-life. That is the word abortion. Right? That's pro-life has to do with abortion. But what does the phrase mean? Well, it means really to be in favor of living, presumably human beings, right? But the unborn is only one subgroup of that. Are you in favor of life? Or just the 1.7% of human beings, which is a number representing the unborn at any particular point in time? Well, I have this general phrase that I identify myself by, I'm pro-life, and I only have a practical group that applies to of 1.7%. Or am I just generally pro-life? Well, let's analyze that. I'm going to do a quick check and see if you are, in fact, in favor of all life. We're going to look at some clips here, and we'll respond to it here in short order.
Last week, 2,000 soldiers died on both sides. 2,000. And they're losing 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 a week. So as we sit here and we talk, people are getting shot and dying on the battlefield. And, they're not American soldiers, but they're Russian soldiers and they're Ukrainian soldiers, and we want to be able to stop it.
Did you hear him say that Russian and Ukrainian and American lives are all equal? Now, he said, listen, American lives aren't dying in Ukraine, but Ukrainians are and Russians are. So he's saying even though American lives are not being sacrificed, it's also important that Russian and Ukrainian lives are being taken. He has equated equally all lives. So I want to move forward in this video. It's the same thing. A few minutes, and we're going to look at that.
I don't want to have that. Think of the parents. Think of whether they're in Russia or Ukraine. Think of the parents of all these people being killed needlessly.
They came to our territory.
Should have.
All right, that was subtle, also, but I'm not sure if you heard that. So what Mr. Zelensky said is that it was kind of under, but and it might not have come across as clear, but so again, Donald Trump is repeating this idea that the mothers are mourning. Russian mothers are mourning. Ukrainian mothers are mourning their children. And Zelensky says, but they invaded our country. In other words, Russian mothers don't have the right to mourn their children because Vladimir Putin, presumably, invaded their country. Now, the whole world is telling us that Vladimir Putin is a dictator, so that means they don't have a choice. But if you want to confirm that, let's look at another short clip that tells us exactly this. And look at these mothers and see if you think that they have a right to mourn.
Детей забрали.
Our children have been taken to this building several hours ago. They are here without food or water.
Parents of Russian conscripts recorded the video at the recruitment center in Moscow. They say that medical examinations are carried out there and they are immediately assigned to military units.
Здесь собрались все родители.
Here are the parents of children who were brought here and who turned out to be unfit for military service. They all have court appeals and medical certificates.
Complaints didn't help. Their sons, unfit for military service, were taken into the army.
They don't look excited. They don't look excited for their children. They have kids being forced to go off to war who aren't even medically cleared. Well, that's brutal. But they don't have a right to mourn. So I want to ask you again, are you pro-life? Or are you just pro-unborn life? What happens after they're born? What happens if they happen to be in a country you don't like? Do they still have a right to life? Or maybe you agree with Elizabeth Warren.
To keep it going for another 5 years?
And she vociferously applauded, nodding up and down, absolutely. 5 more years of this fighting. Maybe you agree with her. By the way, I want to take some videos just so we're clear of what's going on, because we're so horrified at what's happening in Russia with forced conscription. You want to know where else it's happening? Here, take a look at some of this.
60-year-old men who are walking their dogs, and I've also seen people with Down syndrome on the front line.
That last video is a Down syndrome person forced into service on the front lines of Ukraine. Are you pro-life? Are you really pro-life? There is a harsh reality coming for both sides of this war. And first of all, if they want to continue this war, the reality is, and they're already facing it, because they're drafting older and older people. I've seen Russian conscripts 60 years old. The average draft age now for the average draft age in Russia, right, or in Ukraine right now, is 45 years old. They've held off doing the very, very young, and there's a reason for that. But at the end of the previous administration, they said, listen, if you're going to give you more funding, you're going to start drafting 18-year-olds. And they said, no. Can't do that, because they understand this harsh reality. And I want to go to the Bible to talk about this. In the book of Judges, it's chapter 20 and 21. I'm just going to refer to it. And it's not a perfectly analogous situation. The tribe we're looking at, the tribe of Benjamin, is in the story the bad guy, not the good guy. And there's not really a lot of times in war there's not good or bad, but if someone's a bad guy here, they were the bad guy. They were very brutal and vicious and cruel. So it doesn't make a perfect analogy, just so we're aware of that. But one part of the story does, and that's the important part. So they had done, after a brutal murder and a lot of details that I don't want to get into, but Israel ganged up on them. Basically said, we're going after you one tribe at a time, one tribe at a time, one tribe at a time. And in the first 2 attacks, they beat the tar out of Israel. Benjamin was brutal, they were vicious, and they were good warriors. But one of the things that is similar is that they faced a war of attrition. It doesn't make a difference how many people they killed as a percentage. Their numbers were drastically being reduced. And about the 3rd attack, the tide started turning. And it was so much that they were basically forced to surrender after the third of the other 11 tribes attacked them. It was going to go the other way, and it was going to go the other way very quickly. And so God intervenes. He stops the fighting. And there's still a problem because, and he said, listen, we don't want you to be wiped out. But the problem is that you have all this animosity among the other 11 tribes of Israel against the tribe of Benjamin, so that here's this greatly reduced population, and you also have a situation where they said, listen, we don't want to give our daughters to marry those men because they're brutal men. And so there's this furthering of a deep decline of their population because they don't have the base to make a new generation. And so many who are continuing in Ukraine have some of these great noble ideals. We're going to fight to the last man and all these things, right? Because of this sense of justice that we referred to earlier. They shouldn't be allowed to take our land. Whatever the thing is that we're looking at for justice and all these things, they have it's idealism, and it's not practical, because we're eventually going to get to the point where Benjamin ends up. Where is that? In the end, we end up accomplishing the opposite of what we want to accomplish. Benjamin did end up surviving, but barely. And they become a minority, not kind of an afterthought. And some generations later, now, they ended up a couple of hundred years later splitting up. Israel ends up splitting up into two groups. There's the north, which was 10 of the tribes, and then there's the south. And in the south, Benjamin and Judah align. With Benjamin being a small part, it's primarily Judah. So it's known as the kingdom of Judah and Israel. And already Benjamin starts losing their identity a little bit. And though they were still recognizable as their own, they had their own land and had all that. But then after Babylon conquers, what happens is they come back and they are unrecognizable. There's no tribe of Benjamin. Today we just call them Jews. The northern 10 tribes were defeated by Assyria and dispersed who knows where. They never returned from their slavery to the empire of Assyria. But Judah did return, and so did Benjamin, but they were just intermarried, and they had become so small that they lost their national identity. And a lot of this fight over Ukraine is Russia is going to try to take away our identity and exterminate us as a nation, which they've tried to do before. And in the long run, the perpetuation of this war, if we don't see a peace soon and preserve some of the land with some of the people, if it continues, there's going to be a younger and younger draft. And there's going to be enough people killed that there will not be a future generation, and Ukraine will lose its national identity for not having people for the next several generations to replenish it. It will be absorbed in a natural way. What we want to avoid will become, in fact, what happens. Because right now, it's going to get to a point, Ukrainian youths are either dying or they're fleeing to different countries. When they flee to different countries, what's going to happen? They're going to marry into other places. They're going to lose their identity. And that's the inevitability. So what do you want? Are you pro-life? Act like it. What are you for? Really, are you for human life? Are you really for Ukrainian life? Then sue for peace. That's what we need to be. Promoting peace, not violence, not our twisted view of justice, and not our pounds of flesh. Do you really want Ukrainian culture to survive? Well, then we might have to seek something that is a little distasteful to us now, but ends up accomplishing what we want in the long run. My name is Andrew Green. This is the Idea Collision, and I hope you join me next time.